Hey guys, it's Paul, combat veteran, MMA fighter, YouTuber, and today we are back going to be checking out Arch's The Siege of Vraks. Let's get into it.
Very Messiah. As
you guys remember, we have made it through to the point where Cardinal the Cardinal has raised his army and has more or less announced himself as a true threat to Imperial rule on Vraks. And the Imperium has sent one of their elite assassins to attempt to eliminate the Cardinal.
you can probably imagine, things were about to get a lot worse. And it all started with the now Vraks militia, made up, of course, again, partially of various workforces on Vraks, but also enrolled in the Vraks militia were huge numbers of essentially armed gangs and cults that had been following the Cardinal for quite some time now, and had arrived on the planet either with him or shortly thereafter. And as far as they were concerned, somebody had just taken a shot at their messiah. In other words, this was a clear sign of an invasion. The very invasion they had been warned against for so long, and if the enemy was not only finally upon them, but amongst them in this very moment, they needed weapons, real weapons. They were already mostly armed, but they had simply brought with them whatever they could from their home worlds. We're talking simple civilian-issue solid slug weapons like rifles or pistols, maybe one or two automatic pieces here and there, but for the most part they were either very basic solid shot weapons or very simple melee weapons. Clubs, improvised spears, and the occasional sword or maybe a hand axe. Nothing to fight an invading army with. However, they were currently sitting on an armory world.
Yeah, this is interesting for a couple of reasons. First, untrained militia can be a fighting force, but they are just such a cut below an actual organized military that even when their equipment is similar, the disparity in tactics and training is vast, right? Now, it can be compensated for with numbers, the classic example being the Battle of Mogadishu, right, made famous in the movie Black Hawk Down, in which very elite and also very well-equipped U.S. Army Rangers and Delta Force operators were, I'm going to say, were overwhelmed and in many cases killed by unorganized, effectively tribal militia. And this is, of course, a function primarily of one, numbers, but two, home turf advantage. And in terms of the number of casualties sustained by each side, the militia were, by almost all accounts, the loser, probably by an order of magnitude of around 100 to 1.
An armory world with enough vehicles, weapons, ammunition, and general equipment to outfit 10 armies. And the only thing standing between them and all of those goodies were a handful of PDF forces, many of which were already in the Cardinal's service. Doesn't take a genius to see what happened next, does it? And indeed, in many cases, the PDF garrison forces guarding some of the storage areas were simply ordered to stand aside and allow the militia to pillage their bunkers to their heart's content. Local Arbites forces were going to prove less cooperative. The Arbites...
So, what is interesting is this reminds me a little bit of, again, to use a real historic example, of the rise of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. This was, of course, originally a guerrilla group, terror group, that did not expect to field a regular army or hold territory, but by exploiting the disenfranchisement of the Sunni population in Iraq after the U.S. withdrawal, they were able to stand up a fairly large militia group under the auspices of, again, a religious cleric. Really interesting because this story, while having a lot of parallels to Vraks, the Siege of Vraks, and at least this lore, I believe, predates the rise of the Islamic State, which makes it all the more interesting to see how the parallels line up. So, the Islamic State, of course, under their religious leader, al-Baghdadi, I think. This disorganized militia, though, needed a source of weapons. And in some cases, the weapons were turned over by military and police forces in these governments, or in cities and towns and military bases where the leadership was already loyal to the Islamic State. But in most cases, it was used via captured equipment. Now, things get a little tougher because when you have captured equipment, capturing it isn't sufficient. It is necessary, but not sufficient to actually raise an army. You have to be able to fuel the equipment, to get the appropriate rounds for the equipment. You have to maintain it because equipment doesn't last forever. And again, when you operate at scale, things tend to break down pretty quickly, especially in combat. And so the Islamic State, of course, was able to rely on a huge population of very angry Sunni Muslims. Again, commenters, let me know if I'm getting Sunni and Shia backwards, but I'm almost certain it was Iraqi Sunni Muslims that made up most of the Islamic State. But the logistical tail is what they sometimes refer to this as. That was filled by, in a lot of cases, ex-Iraqi army and police that had been trained by the United States. So, in fact, there were a fair amount of people that could do the maintenance on these vehicles and, organize and obtain the weapons. The other source that they had, that Vraks does not, is the Islamic State had a source of funding so that they could purchase many of the things they didn't have in-house, so to speak. They could purchase it on the black market by selling illicit oil. They would capture oil wells and oil refineries and then sell that oil and gas to illegal buyers, usually in Turkey, and then use those proceeds to fund their operation, their military operation, and even their state. Of course, Vraks cannot do this because the Imperium will not let them trade. There is no other third-party world they can trade with that will enable them to continue to run their equipment. And I'm also just sort of curious, as a security measure, right? It seems logical to me that you would not keep an entire army's worth of both gear and ammunition next to each other for exactly this reason. You could get a Lehman Russ, but you shouldn't be able to get rounds for it sitting right next to it. That's a pretty basic security move.
Had deployed immediately after they received news of the assassination attempt, as the zealots were starting to run rampant in the streets, with all the usual complications of death and destruction that is brought about by tens of thousands of crazies venting their frustration, and initially the Abites had some success in dealing with the rioters, mostly due to the straight-out-of-the-gate heavy-handed approach of the local Abites. This was a world with a considerable slave population. As such, they were not exactly strangers to, problems, shall we say, on a civilian level. And the Abites deployed right out of the gate with specially equipped riot rhinos and Abites suppression squads armed with shotguns. They were making short work of the unruly semi-civilian population until they found themselves facing las guns, APCs, and tanks. Granted, Arbites forces on most worlds, and even more so in a war like Vraks, are essentially paramilitary organizations in and of themselves, but this was more than they were used to. They requested support from the Planetary Defense Force, but rather unsurprisingly for anyone who's been paying attention, those requests were usually not answered. The Arbites began retreating back to their precinct fortress house, a mini-fortress inside the fortress.
Yeah, lore experts, I'm curious, how large is an Arbites detachment on most worlds? It seems like they are large enough to operate as a military unit, and again, if you're talking about a world with a population of millions, even something as elite as the Arbites would need to number probably at least, I'm going to say 50,000 in order to be effective at policing a world. Well, okay, they said it was 8 million, so that's like a large city. So yeah, I'm going to say, okay, I'll scale it down. I'll say they've got to be to police 8 million people. I'm going to say they have to be at least 2,500.
Complete with pillboxes, heavy machine gun emplacements, barbed wire, minefields, anti-tank glass, and rocket weaponries, etc., etc. Behind their precinct walls, they fought to the last bullet and the last Arbite, still holding out hope that maybe, just maybe, other forces would eventually arrive to assist them. They held out in this manner for several weeks against practically the entire population of the planet. But at the end, they simply ran out of ammunition, and with nothing to hold the zealous hordes back, the massive armored doors were eventually beaten down and the remaining Arbites torn to pieces, and subsequently paraded through the streets as victory trophies. And when the quote-unquote civilian population is carrying the mutilated corpses of law enforcement through the streets, it is reasonable to assume that things have gotten somewhat out of hand.
Yeah, this is a pretty common trope. It's not a trope. It's a common realistic occurrence when you have lots of anybody who's considered the enemy killed via mob violence, parading corpses through the street, hanging them up. Right? It happened in Iraq. It happened to U.S. forces in Mogadishu. It's just a common trope, and it's in some ways I think it's reflective of human beings. They are near violence, their adrenaline surges, and then suddenly the threat is gone, and you're just elated, angry. It's a weird flood of emotions, and it's tough to manage that if you are a trained professional. And of course, if you are just a civilian who is sort of engaging in violence in a not organized way, not as part of a unit, not with training, it's probably pretty easy to be overwhelmed by that and engage in some pretty cruel behavior. That said, it also serves a propaganda purpose. By parading enemies through the streets, it rallies friendly forces. It demonstrates to maybe people who are open to your cause but are on the sidelines, or people that view you as being ineffective or unable to best the larger, more powerful enemy. It helps motivate them to get off the sidelines. Likewise, it is a deterrent to an enemy to let them know that your forces are not immune. We have been able to strike a blow against you, and if we do succeed, we are willing to desecrate your corpse. And that can have, again, a powerful fear-inducing effect among, again, usually some sort of security force.
And the Cardinal knew this as well. It was becoming increasingly clear to Zaphon that it was now or never. His preachers walked amongst the chain gangs and labor mobs, encouraging them to break their chains. The enemy was upon them, and they should join their brothers in the Frateris militia, loot the armories, and secure the planet. and many did. All over the city, first a few uprisings, then, when those were successful due to the hesitant nature of the official response, many more picked up their shovels and pickaxes and used them to break their own chains. Then put them to far bloodier work, dispatching their ex-guards. Now, of course, Vraks being in part a massive prison colony, this was far from the first time the ungrateful prisoners had a go at breaking their chains. There were protocols in place to deal with just such an event, and normally the Arbites would be more than enough to deal with any such uprising. In this case, well, they had their hands full. If the Arbites were not successful, then the PDF and the Imperial garrison would be sent in, and that should be enough to subdue pretty much any uprising. But that, of course, assumes that the PDF and Imperial garrison will actually obey the instructions issued to subdue the rebellion.
Yep, this is very, very, very common. As we've discussed in my previous video, you have to understand that authoritarians seize power by installing loyalists in every center of power within their government. And of course, the Cardinal did this successfully, and you can see that he is able to therefore shape events by responding heavily to some things and responding slowly or not at all to others. And you can use that to carefully guide events. Again, it wouldn't shock me that if you told me that when the PDF was, say, requested for the Arbites, that the order was approved, but very, very slowly. And the authorized assistance was extremely limited. It also wouldn't shock me if you told me that's how things played out for these rebellions, where, again, the proper procedures are followed, but everything just runs a little slowly, a little underwhelmingly, and ultimately the government just isn't effective at doing its job. And here's the best part, is that let's say there's a loyalist PDF commander, right? And that PDF commander hears about this rebellion. He calls his boss and he says, "Boss, we've got to go. The Arbites are under siege from an angry mob." And the boss, who is a loyalist of the Cardinal, goes, "Let me think about it." And they wait, and they wait, and they wait, and the situation gets worse and worse and worse. And then finally, after a week or 2 weeks, that loyalist PDF commander, he gets authorization to go. But he's told they're civilians, and you can't use any of your tractor vehicles, right? You can only use non-lethal options, right? So it restrains them in some way. So now that you've done that, you send this loyalist commander in, and of course his forces are totally unable to get control of the situation because they, of course, are undersized, understaffed, and don't have the equipment that they need. But that commander has still failed you, and so you can fire him and replace him with a loyalist. And so therefore, without violating any protocol, with a completely reasonable explanation of failure of duty, you can continue to consolidate your power by dispatching more and more loyalists. Of course, perhaps by this point, things had already gone sort of haywire, and the pretense of following any meaningful procedure was abandoned. But, you know, that's how these things tend to play out in the real world.
In this case, though, considerable portions of the PDF and the garrison itself was already well and truly in Zaphen's pocket. And so the elements that did immobilize found themselves in the best-case scenario unsupported and facing vast hordes of armed prisoners, and in the worst-case scenario under direct fire from their supporting units. And what about the Sisters of...
Yep. Called it.
of battle. You might be wondering, where the hell are the Adeptus Sororitas while the entirety of Vraks is tearing itself apart? Well, the prioress of the Order of the Argent Shroud, the senior battle sister attached to the Cardinal, demanded an audience with him to ask precisely that same question. Why had her sisters not been mobilized to aid the garrison forces? At the very least, they should be sent to relieve the Arbites currently under siege in their precinct house. And she was indeed granted her audience, only to be immediately thrown into a prison cell when she showed up for it. The disciples of Zaphen then stormed the priory where the remaining Adeptus Sororitas were housed and placed them all under arrest. Some fought back, but surprised, unequipped, and totally unprepared as they were unable to mount any meaningful resistance. With this latest influx of new prisoners, the cells quickly filled up under the Cardinal's new regime. Fortuitously, the Cardinal already had a solution to this problem at the ready, namely just simply letting all of the old prisoners go, providing, of course, they joined the Frateris militia, to show they had, reformed themselves, obviously. And with the incarcerations of the sisters, the last real barrier to the Cardinal's power had been removed.
This is interesting. This is an interesting decision because there has to be some sort of political reasoning to imprison the sisters when the Arbites were killed. And I suspect, I hypothesize, or if this was a real world scenario, the Colonel would be thinking to himself, it is such a bad look among the people of Vraks that are, again, still on the fence, maybe loyal to the Cardinal but unwilling to take up arms on his behalf, or that the Adeptus Sororitas are still so highly regarded as figures of such true devotion and faith that outright killing them would just look so bad for the Cardinal, he wouldn't be able to do so. I think that's usually pretty common, right? When killing your opponent is just such a bad look. Again, we can look at Russia with his his chief opposition member, Alexei Navalny, where the opposition member is too popular to be killed outright. And so instead, he is harassed, he is poisoned. There's a variety of means and methods that he is incapacitated. He's even been recently sentenced to the Gulag, the labor camp, penitentiary labor camp. I don't know. I'm sure they have a new name for it. But he is not ever killed, even though Russia obviously has the means to kill him at any time. It would just be such a bad look, and it would mobilize his supporters in a way that would be too dangerous for the Russian government. Right, again, perhaps there's a neutral faction or a not yet loyal faction in Vraks, and they fear killing the Sororitas would galvanize resistance against the Cardinal's forces. And even if it's not a majority, still it would create another force like the Loyalist PDF, the Arbites, the Sororitas, another, say, counter militia that the Cardinal would have to deal with.
At the end of several days of rampant rioting, he found himself in, essentially, complete and utter control of Vraks. Those who had previously remained uncooperative did not survive the rioting. This, as mentioned, left the Cardinal in complete control of Vraks. Its vast armories, its defences, its populace, its labour corps, everything. And whilst that might sound like a very good deal, and indeed it was, he had carried out an extraordinarily successful coup, and he had been given justification, at least as far as the population was concerned, to carry it out. It had been, in many ways, the perfect way to do it. The population was now on his side, the ruling elite were on his side, and anyone that wasn't, well, as I mentioned, those didn't survive the riots. However, there was one teensy-weensy problem. The Cardinal was under absolutely no illusions about who had tried to kill him, and he also knew that no matter how clean the rebellion on Vraks might have been, at least from an internal standpoint, it would never be good enough for the Inquisition. As far as they were concerned, he had now seized power over an Imperial world through force. Not an action the Inquisition tend to look upon particularly favourably. And even if, for some mysterious reason, they were so inclined, something roughly as likely as a herd of flying pigs deciding to clean your windows one evening, the Cardinal again knew who had taken a shot at him, and the Cardinal wasn't exactly the forgiving sort either. But in all due reality, all of that is more or less besides the point. The Cardinal was now painfully aware, quite literally through several broken ribs at this point, that he was on an...
If you've ever had a broken rib or even a sprained rib, it is extremely painful. It makes literally breathing literally a pain. And yeah, it's a easy way to really ruin somebody's couple of months, because it's also extra tough because a human being has to breathe, right? And again, your diaphragm has to expand and contract a little bit, and so you can't put a cast on a broken rib. So you just have to wait a long time while it heals, even though you're constantly moving it. It's pretty awful.
Inquisitorial hit list. His only real chance at this point was to seize control of Vraks and raise the flag of independence, at the very least temporarily. It is unclear whether or not the Cardinal was intending to go full-on rogue, or if he had some other motives. We do know that he hadn't gone heretical just yet, at the very least. He still considered himself a faithful servant of the Emperor, and merely a misunderstood individual. And so, probably his best bet would be to try and feign ignorance, perhaps, see if he could find some diplomatic way out of this, or possibly even try to leverage the vast quantities of arms and supplies stockpiled on Vraks in some form of trade. There was, however, one small problem. As you can probably imagine, large-scale rebellions are not the most subtle or indeed precise of tools, and whilst
the biggest problem he seems to have had is that he killed the Imperial forces. My thinking is that, again, the Imperium probably doesn't care that much about changes in governorship, but they probably care very, very much about their staff, we'll say, being killed off. So if you are the Imperium, you may actually tolerate a secular government turning over to a theocracy of sorts, but you definitely won't tolerate your Adeptus Sororitas, your Arbites, being killed off by some authoritarian.
The civilians and the Fraternitas militia were running rampant in the streets. They also broke into the planet's primary administratum complex. Now, on one hand, this was obviously a bastion of resistance against the Cardinal's budding rule, as it would be filled to the absolute brim with various administratum officials, or drones, as the Cardinal would probably like to call them. Of course, these were natural enemies of the new regime and were slaughtered as was only right and proper, but the complex also housed the planet's complement of astropath psykers, Vraks' one and only true way of communicating with the wider Imperium, and the rebels chose to slaughter every single last one of them as well. On the bright side, this obviously prevented the remaining loyalists on the planet from calling for help. But, to be fair, there weren't that many loyalists left. And on the not-so-bright side, it also completely isolated Vraks and prevented the Cardinal as well from talking to the wider Imperium, which meant that the only version of the story the Imperium would be hearing was the Inquisition's side of the story. At this point, there might still have been some way for the Cardinal to try and get out of his predicament if he could reassure the Imperium that he had not wished to take power. He could even perhaps use the vast quantities of weapons and equipment on the planet as a form of bargaining chip to strike some sort of deal for protection against the Inquisition in return for perhaps going back to his Cardinal world and staying there. Instead, now, the first thing he would know about the Imperium's response would be when it arrived on Vraks.
Yeah, that's a... Well, he did it to himself, certainly. And I think it's also worth noting that it's really... It's hard. This is a dangerous game to play. And, eliminating information, right? Preventing it from getting out is so hard to do. And look at the number of, conspiracies, secrets that governments try to perpetrate, and they don't really succeed. Classic example, of course, USSR, just trying to literally wash away people like Leon Trotsky or other people who were originally icons of the initial wave, the initial coup of the Soviets, but then fell out of favor with the ruling elite. And their names are scrubbed from history books. They are removed from photographs. But the reality of what happened to those folks is actually not really in dispute. It's fairly easy to reconstruct it. So the Cardinal, he's functionally a Colonel at this point. The Cardinal would have had a chance to perhaps, it's tough to say. As long as the Inquisition's out there, that if he could eliminate their ability to tell others what has happened on Vraks, then he would have to do that in order to negotiate with the Imperium, right? And of course, there's ways around it, but ultimately, he's probably must be aware at this point that he has functionally sealed his fate by just killing this many Imperial officials and having the Inquisition after him. His best bet, and I suspect this is probably what he did, is you have to at that point reach out to the enemy of my enemy and hope that they view themselves as your friend. This, of course, could be the forces of chaos, right, who would absolutely love the symbolic win of turning a cardinal in the Imperial Church to their side. Could also be forces like the Eldar. Could be someone like the Necrons. Could even maybe be the Tau, but I highly doubt the Tau would agree to go toe-to-toe with the Imperium. In fact, I'm trying to think of who would be willing. Yeah, the problem is you have to offer something that makes the risk worth it. So I guess no Necron would see one Imperial world as being worth risking the wrath of the Imperium to support, nor would any Tau or Eldar. The Tyranids aren't open to negotiation, nor are the Orcs. So yeah, that would basically leave just the forces of chaos.
The only question then was, what form would that response take? A question I am sure both you and the Cardinal are very keen to know the answer to, but you're going to have to wait for that for a while longer, as this is the end of the first episode of the Siege of Vraks.
Alright guys, that does it for the Siege of Vraks Part 1. Now, I've had a lot of fun with this so far, but I can't wait for Part 2. Right? It's going to get tactical. We're going to do some serious battle analysis, and it's going to be a blast. And I hope you're excited for it. I am. And be sure to hit that subscribe button so the algorithm knows that it's going to show, and actually hit the little bell, right? Because that notifies you when new videos come out, and you will be able to see right away when we get into the bloodbath that is the Siege of Vraks. Also, be sure check out the merch store, right? It's the best way to support the channel. I sell mugs, I got t-shirts, I've got all kinds of stuff, and I'm adding new stuff every single week, so definitely check back. And yeah, until next time, I will see you guys later.